Hello, friends. Today, my topic of discussion is nature in English poetry. Let's begin. Many poets not only try to show us what they see, they try to make us understand how they feel. Not only are they connected to nature, but they see life reflected in it. Albert Einstein said, "Look deep into nature, and there you will understand everything better." Nature has been a recurring theme in poetry through the ages. Man and nature are intimately associated. This is no romantic and idealistic slogan, but rises from the very concept of creation as well as coexistence in the universe. Man lives in the bosom of nature, and his environment is mostly built up and affected with natural colors and scenes. And as such, his impulses and aptitude also get much inspiration from the world of nature. As a result, the close association of man with nature is a vital element in the poetical impulse, which is a spontaneous instinct in man. If poetry is the spontaneous overflow of human feelings, this is not seldom related to the world of nature with all its beauty and serenity, plenty and variety. Nature is a popular theme in poetry, and this is true about no particular poetry, but of poetry of all lands and languages. In English poetry, in particular, this is a distinctive feature. As a matter of fact, English poetry in different ages is found to reveal a definite kinship with nature and to invest the natural world with beauty and serenity and mystery. An instinctive passion for nature is found to run through the great works of a good many English poets, ancient as well as modern. In poetry, nature indeed figures prominently, and this has been marked in the very earliest of English poetry, Anglo Saxon poetry. Dwelling in the bosom of nature and wondering at its panoramic mysteries, the primitive Teutonic people had a natural fascination for different kinds of natural operations and charms. Nature was their natural abode. The song of the natural world struck into the inmost core of their ignorant, superstitious, but reverential heart. Their sensations and impulses were roused by the vastness as well as wilderness of different natural phenomena, the sea, the storm, and the wood. All this seemed to inspire their creative genius and drive them to present the world of nature with all its beauty, variety, and majesty. Nature was an abiding influence with the unknown Anglo Saxon poets of the seafarer, the wanderer, and the ruin. This is seen to remain alive in all the varieties of Anglo Saxon poetry, comprising elegies, lyrics, riddles, epics, both non Christian and Christian. Of course, it must be noted in this connection that the Anglo Saxon poets were not the philosophers of nature, they were rather impulsive observers and sensitive painters, wild worshippers, and romantic dreamers. Their literary creation was prompted not by any philosophic speculation on the soul or spirit of nature, but shaped by the reverential portrait of natural elements in their fury as well as beauty. Their approach to nature was primitive, of an ignorant pagan who was struck with awe and wonder at what he could not at all conceive. As a result, Anglo Saxon poets were deeply impressed and influenced by what they beheld around them in the unimaginably vast and mysterious world of nature. The marks of the vast influence of nature on Anglo Saxon poetry are discernible in the celebrated Anglo Saxon lyrics as the seafarer and The Wanderer. The somber and violent picture of the cold and tumultuous northern sea is vivid in The Seafarer, which may rightly be regarded as the forerunner of English nature poetry. The description of the waves and seabirds in the elegy The Wanderer is the conspicuous instance of the effective natural imagery in Anglo-Saxon poetry. The other notable elegy, like The Ruin, too, has some sketches of nature scenery in the description of the desolation of a great city of the past. Nature also adorns Anglo-Saxon Christian poetry. Caedmon's biblical paraphrases contain a few vivid and realistic scenes of nature. Canulp's The Dream of the Rood and the Phoenix, within their symbolic framework, present the mighty natural scenery. The precise description of the natural scenery in the Phoenix also deserves to be mentioned here specifically. In the Middle English period, nature is also found well represented in some allegorical and alliterative poems in particular. In this respect, the Pearl, the Gown and the Green Knight, and the Owl and the Nightingale may be mentioned in particular. The natural scenes drawn in those poems have displayed the originality of their authors in the apt presentation of natural beauty. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight seems to carry on the tradition of the Anglo-Saxon delineation of the majestic, spectacular, and awe-inspiring aspects of nature. In Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer, a great name in English literature, nature has also an adequate representation, of course, not only in a serious vein. His allegorical work, The Parliament of Fowls, reveals his interest in the lively creatures of nature, though his presentation is not serious but diverting and witty. He is found here interested rather in the creatures of nature, the big fowls as well as the little, and not in the charm of natural scenes simply. But the fresh childlike delight in the scenic charm in the nature is well perceived elsewhere in Chaucer, as in the very opening line of the prologue to the Canterbury Tales, we find the line like this: When the sweet showers of April have pierced the drought of March and pierced it to the root, and every vein is bathed in the moisture whose quickening force will engender the flower. And when the west wind too, with its sweet breath, has given life in every wood and field. But English poetry is found to have a great spontaneity in the adoration of nature in the great Elizabethan age. In the newly awakened romantic spirit of that age, love for nature is found to be an unfailing mark. In Edmund Spenser, Shakespeare in particular, Christopher Marlowe, and many other poets, nature is graphically and gracefully presented. Some of Shakespearean plays contain the passages of rare natural beauty and serenity. There is, however, no philosophic speculation of nature. Natural elements are rather shown as the background to reflect human passions and feelings. Of course, there is a decline in the poetic passion for nature in the Augustan poetry of the 18th century. The poetic interest is found shifted to man's social life, and the motto becomes the proper study of mankind is man. This has definitely affected the naturalness of poetry and made it somewhat artificial, lacking in spontaneity. Yet, nature is not altogether ignored even by the great social poet Alexander Pope of the 18th century. His reverential attitude to nature is borne out, at least in his celebrated line in Essay of Criticism. Here he writes, First follow nature and your judgment frame by her just standard, which is still the same. Unerring nature still divinely bright, one clear, unchanged universal light. Alexander Pope is found here to elevate nature and speaks of her majesty and divinity, and this is indicative of the perpetual place of nature in English poetry. The triumphant return to nature in English poetry is perceived in Thomson's The Seasons, which stands out as a milestone in the history of English nature poetry. No one before Thomson could have attempted or even thought to write an entire poem on nature. Thomson's work is tremendously vigorous, and it is found to have established the great tradition of nature poetry in English. Of course, Lady Wencesla is to be mentioned here for pioneering nature poetry in English in her Nocturnal Reverie. Thomson is, however, followed by a number of visionaries, but not thoroughly romantic, and their works are found to carry on the great tradition of English nature poetry set up by him. In Gray and Goldsmith, in Robert Burns and William Blake, in Young and Collins, nature has a clear and idealistic presentation in English poetry. The tradition of nature poetry appears to have a firm base to establish solidity, the kinship of English poetry with nature. The golden period of nature poetry in English is found in the Great Romantic Age, that officially came with the publication of Lyrical Ballads, a joint venture of William Wordsworth and Coleridge. It was published in 1798. A new age of nature poetry and a new view of the spirit of nature are found to have come to in English poetry with this. Nature in this romantic poetry has achieved great dimensions and diverse manifestations in the philosophic and spiritual idealization, as also in the romantic and sensuous representation. The romantic poets look upon nature as living and real, and they animate the world of nature with a diverting cosmic spirit that haunts every natural element and gives it a life and emotion. In Wordsworth's pantheism and Shelley's myth, nature has an original and new presentation. The character of English nature poetry is found to have grown more serious, more philosophically and socially conscious with romantic poets. Wordsworth perceives in nature a majestic spirit, a mighty being that does not live like ordinary beings. To his mystic vision, he feels a presence that disturbs him with the joy of elevated thoughts. His pantheistic view has a cosmic conception of an indwelling spirit that rolls through all external natural objects and man's mind. The poet is also found to have a firm conviction that nature never did betray the heart that loved her, and that it is her privilege to lead from joy to joy. Of course, love for nature is found different in John Keats's or in Walter Scott. In John Keats's poem To One Who Has Been Long in City Pen, in this poem we find what is the craving for nature. We find here the person who is confined for long in a city life. That person is very much missing the natural world, the rustic life. The person is craving to return to the natural world again. He is becoming mad, lacking of the natural world, confining in the city life. Nothing spiritual or mystical is marked in Keats and Walter Scott, and there is an intensively sensuous love for natural beauty for its own sake. Scott's description of winter in Britain is found in his Marmain, and the line is like this: November's sky is chill and drear, November's leaf is red and sere, low in the dark and narrow glen, you scarce the rivulet might ken. Another poet must be mentioned here. His name is Lord Byron. In Lord Byron's Childe Harold's Pilgrims, we find the line like this: There is a pleasure in the pathless woods. There is a rapture on the lonely shore. There is society where none intrudes by the deep sea, and music in its roar. I love not man the less, but nature more. The Romantic poets' love for nature appears to have declined in their successors, the Victorian poets. The Victorian world, so much affected with industrialism, is found to have lost the mental affinity with natural serenity. Yet, Victorian poetry is not totally shut out to the beauty of nature. Alfred Lord Tennyson's poems bear out his love for nature. Keatsian sensuous adoration for nature is seen in Pre-Raphaelite poetry. Nevertheless, nature is glorified when set in a sharp contrast with the life of man by the Victorian poets. The former is conceived here as vast and eternal in comparison with teeny and transitory human life. Tennyson's Babbling Brook has a stern message. In his poem, The Brook, we find the line like this: For men may come and men may go, but I go on forever. Matthew Arnold, another poet in Victorian period, Arnold draws from the working of natural objects a lesson of a quiet and enduring work by the side of man's senseless uproar and meaningless toil. Arnold, in his poem Quiet Work, in this poem he writes, Still do the sleepless ministers move on, their glorious tasks in silence perfecting. Still working, blaming still our vain turmoil, laborers that shall not fail when man is gone. In the context of Romantic period, the American transcendentalists must be mentioned. They also had much affinity, much love for nature, natural world. The writers like Emerson, Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, Walt Whitman lived in the bosom of nature. They felt natural world very much, which came out through their writings in their poetry. This love for nature has not died down in the English poetry of the modern age. The impact of war, the political revolution, the economic problems and scientific development have no doubt arrested much of the congeniality of the love of nature, particularly perceived in Romantic poetry. Yet, nature lives in some salient form or other in modern poetry. Of course, the environment has changed and the character of nature poetry is seen accordingly changed. In Robert Bridges, Hopkins, Yeats, Dylan Thomas, Louis MacNeice, and many others, love for nature expressed in English poetry is found to continue and survive. In Robert Frost's poem, Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening, we find the line like this: The woods are lovely, dark and deep. Nature is an intimate element in English poetry in almost all the ages. Of course, the character of nature poetry, as noted, has changed from age to age, and this is inevitable. But the plentiful growth of poetry in the rich soil of nature is sufficiently illustrative of the possibility of an appropriate attachment to the nature even in modern poetry to come. Nature is romanticized, idealized, more realistically represented in different English poems in different ages. Nature and poetry are never found detached, and the long history of the English poetry sufficiently illustrates the truth of their reciprocal attachment in the poetic theme as well as technique. William Wordsworth's well-remembered expression perhaps best echoes the place of nature in poetry, not of course English only, but in universal human life and literature. He writes in the poem Tintern Abbey the line like this: Knowing that nature never did betray the heart that loved her, it is her privilege through all the years of this our life to lead from joy to joy. And there is also his deep conviction of the bliss of nature, not from the present hours only, but for all times to come. Again, in Tintin Abbey, he writes, "While here I stand, not only with the sense of present pleasure, but with pleasing thoughts that in this moment there is life and food for future years." For all these aspects, for the purity of life, watching the modern city life, Rabindranath Tagore writes, "Give back that forest, take your towns." Thank you. The name of my Facebook page is Inglit. You may find my videos. You can follow there also.